from a couple schools here, Clark University and University of Arizona, and we're all going out to the BDS conference this weekend. And so we first wanted to just jump in and ask what your thoughts, if imagining you're speaking before 150 organizers from all around the country on BDS. I wanted to ask your thoughts on issues concerning the beginnings of this movement, like things to be cautious of, what you would say to them if you have the time before them, and what things could work and everything.
I'd say Hampshire. I thought their statement was a really good model of what it ought to be, and I was one of them, signed it right away. It was a good model because it kept to a couple of crucial points. One was, you got to make a distinction anytime, if you're in an activist movement, between sort of feel-good tactics and do-good tactics. And there's a lot of tactics that make you feel good, but they may even be harmful to the victims. There are others that do good, and they're usually more moderate, like they don't express your full feelings because you can't. And that's important. Now, in this case, it's very striking. If you want to do good, you have to recognize that any change in Israel-Palestine is going to come from Washington. Israel's going to do as much as it can that the U.S. permits. As long as the U.S. permits it or supports it, they'll do it. If the U.S. puts its foot down, they'll stop. There's a lot of talk about South Africa, and there are various analogies which you can argue about. But there's one thing that you can't argue about. We should learn from what happened in South Africa. Independent of the analogies, there's a lot you can learn. In the case of South Africa, by the 60s, the nationalists, the white nationalists in South Africa were approximately in the situation of Israel today. They were becoming a pariah state internationally. They were getting a lot of attack. They were losing the votes in the UN and so on and so forth. And they reacted exactly the same the way Israel's doing. Big information campaigns, explaining why we're right, you don't understand us, and also with a lot of paranoia, partly accurate, partly exaggerated, about how badly they're being treated. So if you look at Israel today, it's an extremely paranoid society. Why does the world hate us? Everywhere we go, people say we're lepers and so on and so forth. But we're right and they're all wrong, and we're going to keep going. All right, the South African minister back in the 60s put his finger on it exactly. He was talking to his U.S. counterpart, and he said, look, everyone's voting against us at the UN, but it doesn't matter, because there's only one vote at the UN, namely yours. Okay, and as long as you're backing us up, we don't really care what the world thinks. And in fact, that turned out to be precisely accurate. The U.S. continued to back South Africa publicly through the 70s, and nothing happened. By around 1980, opposition to apartheid was so strong that nobody was publicly defending it. Congress was passing resolutions, corporations were refusing to invest on their own, and so on. Actually, the first divestment BDS proposal in the United States was in Hampshire. It was in 1977, right around that time. But then they were pushing an open door because nobody was defending apartheid. It's quite different from Israel today. Through the 80s, the Reagan administration continued to support South Africa, but they had to do it secretly, clandestinely, because they were violating congressional resolutions. But they did, and as late as 1988, they condemned the ANC as one of the more notorious terrorist groups in the world. That was 1988. In fact, Mandela was just taken off the terrorist list about a year ago. However, around 1988 and 89, the U.S. shifted and said, okay, we're not going to support it anymore. 2 years later, it was gone. Okay, that's exactly the way it works. There's case after case like that. It's kind of like the mafia. Godfather changed his position. Okay, a lot of things happen. So any campaign that's going to do any good has got to be aimed at the U.S. Now, a lot of the BDS campaigns have a negative effect, I think, because they exclude the U.S. Actually, it's the same with the Goldstone report. It's just about Israel. Nothing in it. That was a joint war. The U.S. participated in the war. Mm-hmm. So any crime that Israel committed, it's a U.S. crime. U.S. weapons, U.S. support, so on. And unless the BDS campaign, if a BDS campaign is going to have an effect, first of all, it's supposed to be educational. It's not just boycotting. It's supposed to educate people. And you have to educate them about what's true, not what's false. The standard line here is the U.S. is an honest broker, standing between two sides, trying to bring them together. It's total crap. For 35 years, the U.S. alone has been blocking a diplomatic settlement. It supports everything that Israel does. And if it does not support what Israel does, they stop. Like they would like the U.S. to bomb Iran, and the U.S. is telling them, sorry, you can't do it. So they don't. And it's got to be that way. They're too dependent on the United States to violate. The only reason, people talk about Netanyahu defying Obama, that's complete nonsense. When Obama didn't say anything, he said, anything we do is going to be purely symbolic, which is just saying, fine, go ahead. If they wanted to stop settlements, they'd do it tomorrow. So any BDS campaign has to be oriented that way, and that's one reason why the Hampshire campaign is good. It talks about sending weapons to Israel, which in fact is illegal under U.S. law, and that should be pushed. It is in fact illegal for all kind of reasons. First of all, because they're not using them in self-defense. They're engaged in torture. Straight U.S. law. They can't send weapons to Israel. They're going after corporations that are involved in occupied territories. That's fine. They're all violating the international code on multinational corporations. Fine, so let's go after them. On the other hand, to take sort of another extreme, if you boycott, say, an Israeli dance group, first of all, that it may make Israelis feel uncomfortable. It may make you feel good, but having nothing to do with changing policy. And in fact, it's negative because it's diverting attention away from U.S. policy. And it also opens you up to a charge of hypocrisy. And you don't want to do that. That's giving a weapon to the enemy. They can come back and say, why are you boycotting this dance group? You're not boycotting an American dance group. The United States, for the U.S., supporting Israeli crimes is way down the list of U.S. crimes. So, the answer is, from hardline supporters of Israeli policies, well, you guys are just hypocrites. You're going after Israel either because you're anti-Semites or just because you're cowards. You don't want to go after the U.S. because it's too strong, so you go after the little guy. And you don't want to do things that open that door because they win. You don't want to carry out BDS or any tactic in a way which gives support to the people you're trying to undermine. Okay, and things have to be crafted that way, and they often are. Often they are, like Hampshire. But it seems to me those are the kinds of considerations that have to be kept in mind. BDS alone is just kind of a blunt instrument. It can be used effectively. It can be used harmfully, and that was the case in South Africa. And you have to remember that in South Africa, it wasn't applied until the educational programs had reached the point where you couldn't get any congressional support for apartheid. We're obviously very far from that. It's easier now than a couple of years ago. There's a lot more public understanding, but that has to be built on. So anyhow, it seems to me those are the kinds of guidelines that have to be kept in mind.